Hello everyone, my name is Max Leisman, and today I'll be speaking to you about the possibility of silicon-based life. So to start, I just have a quick table of contents. I'm going to just have my intro, and then I'll talk about the next slide, carbon-based life, followed up by why silicone, and then I'll look at some examples of silicon-based life, and more specifically the implications of it. Then I'll talk about a possible location of silicon-based life, followed up with a couple problems with silicon as a means of life, and then I'll look at some research on the topic, essentially looking at the scope of how it's evolved over the past few years, and then I'll finish it all up with my conclusions. So let's get started. Starting with carbon-based life. So to begin, it's life as we know it. It's carbon. It's what every living thing we've ever known has ever been made of, and likely, probably, it ever will. So to find my research on this, I looked at Britannica Encyclopedia, which found three key factors when it comes to carbon-based life. The first is self-bonding. Carbon-carbon bonds are some of the strongest and most stable, and carbon compounds can exist over a wide range of temperatures and conditions, which is important for life because then it can exist in a myriad of different environments. Secondly, we have carbon chains, which are essentially the basis for cells. For example, DNA is made of two intertwined molecules built around a carbon chain. And then lastly, we have rings. Carbon rings effectively bind oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen covalently to form a bunch of different molecules that are important for cellular functions. Essentially, these three factors of carbon make it the base of life in our planet and likely around the universe. However, with the idea of alternative biochemistry effectively meaning things that aren't carbon-based and other basically element-based, one particular element comes to mind, that being silicon. So, why silicone? In my research, which is based on the following three sources, a Smithsonian Magazine article discussing silicon life and two peer-reviewed research articles published in the Journal of Cosmology and the U.S. National Library, I found 7 key reasons as to why silicon is a likely candidate for another base of life. The first being the abundance of silicon. It is the second most abundant element in Earth's crust after oxygen. If life were to evolve in environments with significantly different conditions than Earth's, silicon-based life might be more prevalent. Secondly is the similar chemical bonding. Because silicon shares some chemical similarities with carbon, it is placed in the same group as it, group 14, on the periodic table. And they can also form covalent bonds, and silicon can create long-chain molecules similar to carbon. Third, temperature tolerance. Because silicon compounds are generally more stable at high temperatures than their carbon counterparts, this could potentially allow for silicon-based life to exist in extreme environments, which is something carbon cannot do. Alternative structure. Silicon-based organisms might employ a different sort of structural molecular base than carbon life. Silicones, for instance, are silicon-oxygen polymers that can resemble hydrocarbons in their structure. These compounds are known for their stability and resistance to the extremes, making it key to a possible life form. Then we have hypothetical planetary conditions. It is possible that a planet with a vastly different conditional makeup than Earth, where carbon-based chemistry might not work as effectively, and therefore silicon might step in as a viable alternative. Then we have the versatility of silicon. While not quite as versatile as carbon, silicon can still form a wide range of compounds, including silicates, siloxanes, and silanols, which could potentially serve as the building blocks for a silicon-based life form. Then lastly, we have the solvent possibilities of silicon. In our carbon-based biology, water acts as a universal solvent. However, in a silicon-based life form might use a different solvent, such as liquid ammonia or liquid sulfur, which can remain in a liquid state at lower temperatures than water, meaning that silicon could work better in a different environment, specifically one that's colder. Now, looking at silicon-based life. Here, I found an article from Scientific American that outlines a few key points. First is that, in a broad consensus, silicon life is unconfirmed. We've never seen it, and more importantly, we likely never will. However, if we were to find it, it is found that the life forms that spawn from it would likely be similar to how carbon life forms appear. And this kind of comes in the wake of many people believing that silicon life forms would look very different and very alien and not at all like carbon. However, it is often thought that realistically a silicon life form is just taking the carbon, moving it out of the way, and putting the silicon back in there, meaning they would likely look the same. And third and finally, there is a slim chance of evidence, and that was from a Caltech study, which I'll discuss here, The Caltech study was a possible answer to the idea of can silicone be a possible life source? And what scientists did in this study was that they found a bacterium from a hot spring which had a very specific enzyme, which was cytochrome C, and that's known to transfer electrons to proteins, making it very, very useful in sort of the realm of biochemistry. But in the case of this study, the researchers were able to make this enzyme add silicons to hydrocarbons that it was distributing, which distributing hydrocarbons is generally a key feature of enzymes in a cell. And so for it to include the silicone into it, it isn't necessarily conclusive evidence that a life form can exist solely off silicone, but it is a great sort of base of knowledge to go from and say, well, we can at least incorporate silicone into our everyday lives, specifically cellular functions. Next, we have possible location of silicone. The sort of main one is actually here in our own solar system. And by reading a Smithsonian Magazine article, I found that that location is Titan, which is a moon of Saturn. And there are kind of four main reasons as to why it would be a great habitat, I guess, for silicone life. And the first is being that there's no oxygen in the atmosphere, which means that, unlike here on Earth, the silicone in Titan wouldn't immediately oxidize into rock. Then secondly, we have frozen water. This is kind of important because silicone bonds become unstable, like extremely unstable actually, when interacting with liquid water, meaning any organism based on it probably wouldn't have a fun time in liquid water. And then next we have the lakes and rivers of methane, which are a huge geological feature of Titan. They act as a possible solvent, just as water acts as a solvent for us here on Earth. And then lastly, Titan's atmosphere is actually rich in complex organic molecules, including hydrocarbons and nitriles. These sort of act as the potential building blocks for a silicone-based biochemistry ecosystem, which very well might be remaining on Titan as we speak. Now I'm going to look at some problems with silicone. Generally speaking, it isn't considered as likely to be the base of life, given the sort of pros of carbon and the cons of silicone, if that makes sense. I looked at a Harvard University document about alternative biochemistries, and it outlined the following issues. The first is sort of the most pressing one and the most commonly sort of introduced in discussion, which is the size of silicone. Because the atoms are much bigger, they have a lot larger mass and atomic radius, and so they'll have difficulty forming double or triple covalent bonds, which are of course very important for biochemical systems, as we saw with carbon, forming long chains and rings. Next, as I've kind of talked about a couple times, silicone is very unstable in water, as chains will usually break apart, and carbon-carbon bonds are stronger than silicon-silicon bonds when placed in liquid water, meaning it kind of makes more sense for carbon to be a base of life in almost any planet. And then next, we have biological versatility. Like I said, silicone is not as versatile as carbon, meaning when you come down to it, the odds are that carbon is much more likely, because it's more versatile. It can form more compounds, more organic molecules, and other things that can support life in a ecosystem, whereas silicone, its options are more limited, while possible are just more limited, and therefore the odds are a bit lower of it actually being a base of life. And then fourth and finally, the high energy required for silicone bonds. It takes a lot more energy to break and form these bonds, which could make it a lot harder for life to sort of evolve and grow, given that in natural environments, you have to use your energy to do things like hunt, eat, drink, and all sorts of things, and to have to spare some of that to, I guess, break the bonds at a cellular level might create a lot of issues when talking about silicone-based life. Now I'll look at sort of the base of knowledge when it comes to silicone life. There's not too much compared to obviously carbon-based life, because, well, we've never seen it. But there are a couple key points that I found within sort of a timeline format. The first being that the idea of a different life form, specifically silicone-based life, was first proposed in 1891 by a German astrophysicist named Julius Schneider. And this sort of spawned in a bunch of different discussions in both fiction and fact about what it is that could be out there in the universe. What do these organisms look like? What do they look like if they're based on carbon and versus silicone, and all those types of ideas. But then the next sort of step in the research was in the 1920s, which was research by Frederick S. Kipping. His research more so focused on silicone as a means to create different biological materials, which gave leeway to the discussion of could this be sort of supporting life. Then next, kind of a weird one, but the Viking lander in 1976, when it landed on Mars and it didn't find life on Mars, which was its goal, it kind of created the discussion of, well, maybe life exists on other planets in a different way, i.e. silicone. So that sort of mission by NASA sort of spurred that discussion. The next we have the 1980s. I found two studies here, one by a man named Hack and another by Heron. These two studies, while they're pretty long and kind of just discuss a bunch of scientific jargon. The reason I kind of included them here is because they come to the same kind of conclusion about silicon, which is that it's very limited and probably won't support life because it's just not flexible enough compared to carbon. Then now we have the 2000s onwards, and that's when we kind of get into the exoplanets and moons territory. The key thing here is that we're exploring new environments such as Titan, a moon of Saturn, and then exoplanets thousands of light years away. And we're seeing that, hey, maybe it is possible to support the idea of silicon-based life. So really the kind of trend of the research here is that like we get an idea, we question it, and then later on we'll find evidence that potentially supports it. But once again, with no conclusive evidence, it's really hard to kind of draw to any exact conclusions about silicon life. And then here are my own conclusions based on the research I've done over this past week. The first is that silicon life probably doesn't exist. It's just too difficult given the difficulties I explained. And the other part is there's just no evidence here on Earth of it. And while it could exist somewhere in the universe, it likely doesn't. However, like I say here, it is still possible, and the universe is large. As we can see here, here's a nice view of the universe. Within this photo alone are probably millions upon millions of different stars and trillions of planets. And with that said, silicon life could be out there somewhere, and it's probably just waiting for us to find it. All that I have left to say is thank you. And here's my bibliography.